Imagine a world where Africa's vast gold, diamond, and oil reserves served its own people. A continent where every village had electricity, every child had education, and every citizen shared in the wealth buried beneath their feet. But that dream was stolen, not by fate, but by history. Africa was once home to some of the richest kingdoms the world had ever seen. Mali, Songhai, Egypt, Nubia, Great Zimbabwe, empires that traded gold for silk, ivory for spices, and wisdom for respect. Yet today, many African nations still struggle with poverty, corruption, and underdevelopment. Why? Because 5 catastrophic forces stripped Africa of its wealth, dignity, and direction. If these 5 things hadn't happened, Africa would likely stand as one of the richest continents on Earth. 1. The transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade remains one of the darkest and most devastating chapters in human history, a period when millions of Africans were violently uprooted, sold, and shipped across the Atlantic to labor on plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were captured, with an estimated 2 million dying during the horrific Middle Passage. What began as a trade in human beings soon became a vast system of economic exploitation that reshaped Africa's destiny, setting the foundation for the poverty that still grips much of the continent today. Before the slave trade, Africa was not the dark continent portrayed in colonial propaganda. It was home to powerful kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo, with advanced systems of governance, education, and trade. Gold, ivory, and textiles flowed across trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean routes, linking Africa to Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. But when European powers realized the wealth that could be extracted from African bodies, everything changed. Coastal raids, intertribal wars, and kidnappings intensified as European traders armed local leaders with guns in exchange for slaves. Entire communities were depopulated, agricultural systems collapsed, and traditional industries declined as able-bodied men and women were stolen from their lands. The slave trade created a cycle of destruction that crippled Africa's social and economic foundations. Families were torn apart, population growth stagnated, and many societies lost their most productive members: farmers, artisans, warriors, and thinkers. This human drain made it nearly impossible for African communities to sustain stable economies or defend themselves against external invasions. Meanwhile, the wealth extracted from African labor in the Americas fueled Europe's Industrial Revolution. The profits from slave plantations financed factories, ships, and banks, laying the groundwork for modern Western capitalism, while Africa sank deeper into poverty. Furthermore, the slave trade sowed divisions and distrust among African communities. European traders encouraged rival chiefs to raid neighboring villages for captives, undermining unity and cooperation. This manipulation weakened African states and made them vulnerable to later colonization in the 19th century. When slavery was finally abolished, Africa's population had been decimated, its economies destroyed, and its political systems destabilized, conditions that colonial powers easily exploited during the scramble for Africa. The long-term consequences of the slave trade are still visible today. Many African nations struggle with underdevelopment, fractured societies, and economic dependency rooted in centuries of exploitation. The loss of millions of young, skilled Africans robbed the continent of human capital that could have driven innovation and progress. Instead, Europe and the Americas grew rich from Africa's pain. The poverty seen in Africa today is not the result of failure or laziness, but the lingering legacy of a global system built on African suffering. The transatlantic slave trade did not just steal people, it stole centuries of potential. 2. Colonial exploitation of Africa. The colonial exploitation of Africa was one of the most destructive forces in the continent's history, a process that stripped Africa of its wealth, dismembered its societies and restructured its economies to serve European interests. Beginning in the late 19th century, after the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European powers divided Africa like a piece of property, ignoring ethnic boundaries, cultures, and existing political systems. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and others invaded and occupied vast territories, claiming to bring civilization, but their real goal was economic domination and resource extraction. This era of exploitation laid the foundation for much of Africa's poverty today. Under colonial rule, African societies were reorganized around the interests of the colonizers. European powers forced Africans to grow cash crops such as cocoa, cotton, coffee, and rubber, not for local use, but for export to European factories. Minerals like gold, diamonds, and copper were extracted by African laborers under harsh conditions, enriching Europe while impoverishing local communities. Infrastructure, roads, railways, and ports was built not to connect African towns or improve domestic trade, but to transport resources directly from mines and plantations to coastal ports for shipment to Europe. Even education was limited and designed to produce clerks and laborers who would serve colonial administrators rather than empower Africans with leadership or technical skills. Colonialism also imposed artificial borders that forced together rival ethnic groups and split others apart, creating deep divisions that still fuel conflict and instability across the continent. Traditional governance systems were dismantled, and local kings or chiefs were often replaced or manipulated by European authorities. Africans had no say in how they were governed, taxed, or exploited. Through violence and coercion, colonial powers introduced systems of forced labor and heavy taxation that kept Africans economically dependent and politically powerless. The economic structure established during colonialism remains largely intact today. African economies still rely heavily on the export of raw materials and the import of finished goods, the same pattern set by the colonizers. This dependency prevents industrial growth and traps African nations in cycles of economic vulnerability. When global commodity prices fall, African countries suffer devastating financial shocks because their economies were never diversified. Moreover, the wealth generated from Africa's resources was not reinvested in the continent. Instead, it built the great cities and industries of Europe, while leaving Africa underdeveloped. Colonizers extracted not only minerals and crops, but also human potential through education systems that deliberately suppressed African advancement. When independence came in the mid-20th century, African nations inherited fragile economies, weak institutions, and arbitrary borders, all products of colonial rule. Today, the legacies of colonial exploitation continue in the form of neocolonialism, where foreign corporations and governments still control Africa's natural resources and markets. Thus, Africa's poverty is not a natural state, but the result of centuries of deliberate plunder, systemic underdevelopment, and external control. Colonialism didn't just end, it evolved, leaving Africa struggling to reclaim the wealth and power that was stolen from it. 3. The assassination of African revolutionary leaders. The assassination of African revolutionary leaders and Pan-Africanists stands as one of the greatest tragedies in the continent's modern history, a systematic destruction of visionary leadership that crippled Africa's path toward unity, independence, and self-reliance. From the 1950s through the 1980s, Africa witnessed a wave of assassinations and political eliminations targeting leaders who dared to challenge Western dominance and promote African-centered development. Figures such as Patrice Lumumba of Congo, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, overthrown in a coup, and many others were either killed or removed through foreign-backed conspiracies. Their deaths were not isolated incidents. but part of a broader effort by Western powers to maintain economic and political control over Africa during the Cold War. The removal of these leaders left a deep vacuum that derailed Africa's progress and set the stage for decades of instability and poverty. These revolutionary leaders shared a common vision: a united, self-sufficient Africa, free from Western dependence. They promoted industrialization, education, land reform, and the use of Africa's vast natural resources for the benefit of Africans themselves. Lumumba, for example, wanted Congo's mineral wealth, particularly its uranium and copper, to serve its people, not foreign corporations. His assassination in 1961, orchestrated by the CYA and Belgian interests, returned the country's resources to Western control and plunged Congo into decades of dictatorship under Mobutu Sese Seko. Similarly, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso launched bold social and economic reforms between 1983 and 1987, focusing on women's rights, self-sufficiency, and anti-corruption. His assassination in 1987, backed by foreign and internal elites, reversed his progress and restored neocolonial dependence. Each of these assassinations did more than end a life. They destroyed a movement. The deaths of these leaders created fear among other African politicians, discouraging bold, independent thinking and reinforcing compliance with Western interests. Many successor regimes were either Western-backed dictatorships or corrupt governments that prioritized personal power over national progress. The absence of revolutionary leadership also fragmented the Pan-African movement, halting efforts toward continental integration and collective economic strength. Instead of building a unified economic bloc, Africa became divided into weak states, each vulnerable to exploitation by foreign corporations and political manipulation. The assassination of these leaders also had devastating psychological and cultural effects. It demoralized a generation of Africans who had believed in the possibility of true freedom and prosperity. Education, healthcare, and economic independence, central to the visions of leaders like Nkrumah and Sankara, were replaced with policies dictated by international institutions such as the IMF and World Bank, deepening Africa's dependency and debt. By eliminating those who sought to redefine Africa's destiny, colonial and neo-colonial powers ensured that Africa's wealth continued to flow outward. 4. Prolonged civil wars and resource conflicts. Prolonged waves of civil wars and resource conflicts have been among the greatest obstacles to Africa's progress, trapping many nations in cycles of instability, destruction, and deep poverty. Since the era of independence, Africa has witnessed numerous internal wars, often sparked by ethnic divisions, political power struggles, and competition over valuable natural resources like oil, diamonds, and minerals. These wars have not only claimed millions of lives, but have also shattered economies, destroyed infrastructure, displaced populations, and diverted national resources from development to warfare. The result is a continent rich in natural wealth, but impoverished in reality, a direct outcome of decades of internal conflict. Civil wars have devastated some of Africa's most resource-rich nations. In countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, wars fueled by the struggle to control diamonds, gold, and oil turned entire nations into battlefields. Rebel groups, often funded by illegal resource trade, fought governments in brutal conflicts that lasted for years. Instead of wealth being used to build schools, hospitals, and industries, it was channeled into purchasing weapons, enriching warlords, and empowering foreign companies that exploited Africa's instability for profit. These wars crippled local economies and made development nearly impossible. For example, Sierra Leone's 11-year civil war, financed by blood diamonds, destroyed the nation's economy and infrastructure, leaving deep scars that are still visible today. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, one of the world's richest countries in terms of natural resources, Decades of conflict over minerals such as cobalt, coltan, and gold have created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Armed groups continue to exploit mineral-rich regions, forcing civilians into labor and displacing millions. The government's weak control and the presence of foreign interests have turned the DRC's wealth into a curse rather than a blessing. This resource curse has become a common pattern across Africa, where abundance of natural resources leads to corruption, war, and underdevelopment instead of prosperity. Civil wars have also destroyed vital infrastructure such as roads, schools, hospitals, and farms, making recovery difficult even after peace is achieved. Agricultural production declines during war, leading to food shortages and famine. Foreign investors withdraw, and skilled professionals flee abroad, creating brain drain and leaving countries without the human capacity needed for rebuilding. The cost of post-war reconstruction drains national budgets for decades, trapping countries in debt and dependency on foreign aid. Furthermore, wars weaken political institutions and promote corruption. Leaders often use war to consolidate power, manipulate ethnic divisions, and embezzle state resources under the guise of security spending. This undermines democracy and good governance, two key pillars of sustainable development. The social impact is equally devastating. Millions of Africans have been displaced by war, living as refugees or internally displaced persons in camps with little access to education or healthcare. A generation has grown up in conflict zones without stability or opportunity. This loss of human capital perpetuates poverty, as the continent's most valuable resource, its people, is left traumatized and uneducated. In essence, Africa's prolonged civil wars and resource conflicts have turned natural wealth into instruments of destruction rather than development. They have eroded trust in governments, crippled economies, and deepened inequality. Until Africa resolves the root causes of its internal wars, corruption, greed, and external exploitation, the continent will continue to struggle with poverty despite its immense natural and human potential. 5. Neocolonialism and corruption. Neocolonialism and corruption are two interlinked forces that have deeply entrenched poverty across Africa. After gaining independence in the mid-20th century, many African nations believed freedom would bring economic prosperity. However, the shadow of colonialism never truly disappeared. It merely changed form. Neocolonialism emerged as a system through which former colonial powers and global institutions continued to dominate African economies, politics, and resources through indirect means. Instead of direct rule, Western powers exerted control using trade policies, debt dependence, and multinational corporations, ensuring that Africa remained a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. This economic arrangement traps African countries in cycles of dependency. International loans, often tied to conditions from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, force nations to adopt policies that benefit foreign interests rather than local development. For example, privatization and structural adjustment programs in the 1980s and 1990s weakened public institutions, reduced social spending, and opened African markets to exploitation. As a result, profits from Africa's vast mineral and agricultural wealth flowed out of the continent, leaving behind poverty, unemployment, and underdevelopment. At the same time, corruption within African governments compounded the damage. Many post-independence leaders, influenced by greed or pressured by foreign powers, mismanaged public funds and enriched themselves while their citizens suffered. Billions of dollars meant for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure were siphoned into private accounts abroad. Corruption also discouraged investment, weakened the rule of law, and eroded public trust in leadership. In resource-rich nations like Nigeria, Angola, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Oil and mineral revenues have fueled elite wealth rather than national progress. Together, neocolonialism and corruption have ensured that Africa's resources serve foreign and domestic elites instead of ordinary Africans.